tell the audience about how you got started in real estate.
Welcome to the Masters in Real Estate podcast with your host, Tanner Webster.
We'll say that I'm just a simple market rate housing developer, and I want to start doing stuff with affordable housing. Let's start with LIHTC and kind of move our way through the affordable housing spectrum. So starting with that, how would you tell a market rate developer how to do their first LIHTC project?
Well, first I tell them probably don't do it or find a partner who has done LIHTC before. I'm not an affordable housing developer. I work for a real estate and public policy consulting firm called HR&A Advisors, but I do work in affordable housing finance. And what people say about affordable housing is that it's just like development, but you're building a puzzle at the same time. So I think
DMV at the same time. Yeah.
With the DMV, with oftentimes multiple. So it's challenging, but there are reasons you would do it, and not just mission regions. There are folks who do make quite a bit of money in affordable housing. But if you're just a market rate developer, find a partner who has done LIHTC development in the past, and that's probably good advice if you're a multifamily guy doing your first industrial, or retail strip mall guy doing your first kind of larger big box retail store. But it's even more important for affordable housing because the way low income housing tax credits, LIHTCs, are allocated are based off of what's called a qualified allocation plan, a QAP, allocated at the state level. So each state has their own priorities about what they want to see, their own scoring criteria, their own rules about what you have to do. But most states, as part of their rules, have something about, have you done this before? Does your team know how to do this? Can your team build this sort of project? So the first part is finding a partner that, is going to be a co-GP or otherwise providing you the support for you to do your first project. But I'd say there's almost a preliminary question of, should I want to do a LIHTC project? That might be worth getting into as well.
Yeah, let's get into that. Why, I guess, if you are a market rate developer, where would you suggest that I start?
Yeah, so oftentimes it's folks who have land that isn't right for market rate development for whatever reason. Or maybe there is a mission component, or maybe it's a public-private partnership where you have an affordability requirement if you're getting your land from a local government or a faith-based organization, or just any sort of mission-driven landowner. So why would somebody do a LIHTC development? The economics are different than a market rate development and somewhat more counter-cyclical than market rate developments. The way you make money if you're a market rate developer, which I haven't been, but I know a lot of market rate developers, and correct me if I'm wrong, is you make money by renting for whatever asset is, renting or selling for the highest rate, and building for the lowest cost. And there's other things you can do, but fundamentally your goal is to maximize profit and then realize that profit.
I would agree.
LIHTC works differently. Goal of affordable housing is that you're not maximizing those rents, right? You're keeping rents. Ideally, it's below prevailing market. It's for a low-income housing tax credit deal, it's an average of 60% of area median income. So in some submarkets, that is market. In most submarkets, it's below market for nice new construction housing because folks will pay a premium for new construction versus older stock. So, you remove the incentive for raising rents as high as you can, as high as the market will allow you to, it changes the incentive structure. So whereas if you're a market rate developer, you're putting in a lot of equity, you're putting money into a deal. Equity doesn't work the same way in LIHTC. In fact, it's pretty typical for a GP to put in $100 of equity for a 100-unit deal. Where you get your financing is from the low-income housing tax credit, and there's two. There's the 4%, there's the 9%. What's important for this conversation is that 9% are extremely limited and competitive. 4% are historically have not been limited, but now they're competitive in 35 states, and the way they're competitive is through allocations of tax-exempt bonds that the federal government authorizes states to allocate. So if you have, and to build your project as a 4% LIHTC deal, at least 50% of your project needs to be funded with tax-exempt bonds. The LIHTC generates anywhere from 30 to 40% of the present value of your development, and for the purposes of this conversation, I'm going to call it free money from the government. It's much more complicated than that, and the way it's allocated and sold is actually a very creative public-private partnership. But it flows into a project as free money that is provided to you through the construction period. That then there are a bunch of rules and regulations that you need to take care of for 10 years so that the tax credit is paid out. And there's a whole economic system of banks and syndicators and other folks who are mission-driven or yield-driven that changes how much they will buy a tax credit for. Happy to get into that. But for the purposes of a project sources and uses, it looks like free money from the government. The other source is, of course, senior debt. And it's tax-exempt debt. You have to hit a 50% test, but also for permanent financing, it's pretty rare for a project at 60% AMI to cover, from a DSCR perspective, 50% of the cost. So typically you float up 50% during construction and then down to whatever you can support, 20, 30, 40% of your total development cost is capitalized into your sources. So we got 40% at the high end for LIHTC. We got 40% at the high end for your senior debt. You have a gap of 20%. And it's a gap that is below, the cash flow to pay it is below a 1.2 or 1.15 DSCR. It typically comes in the form of subordinate debt from a local or state government. Each jurisdiction has their own rules about how that works. It can be subordinate debt from a mission-driven investor as well, like a PRI from a philanthropy, or from a housing commitment from a private corporation. But generally, your subordinate debt is, anywhere from 1 to 3 to 4% interest rate, soft pay. It, really is intended to be resubordinated. And typically it's a local or state government providing that financing. And you have a whole nother set of applications for that. And the applications that you have to your local government may not align with the application that you have to your state government, HFA. And oftentimes folks are cobbling together different sources where maybe they'll get $1 million from the Federal Home Loan Bank's affordable housing program. They'll get $1 million grant someplace else. They'll get, $3 million from their city. Maybe they'll get $1 million more from their county. And overall, you just build up all these sources with different rules and different application processes and requirements that don't always align. And as a kicker, you put in a deferred developer fee as well, where we didn't talk about how a developer makes money off of LIHTC. And if you're not going to make money because you have a residual value that is higher than what you built, because you can't max rents, what it means is you got to be compensated on a fee basis. So where a market rate development management fee is anywhere from 2.5% to 4%, really just enough to keep your lights on. A developer fee for a LIHTC project can be upwards of 15% of your total development costs. Now, it changes by state. I'll use Maryland as an example. If you utilize state subordinate debt financing in Maryland, they cap your developer fee at a certain amount. So you see 4% projects in Maryland tend to be around 100 units, not 200 units, because every additional unit you're building, you're not getting more fee. Every state is unique. So when you are looking for a partner, you should find a partner that has done LIHTC in the jurisdiction you're looking in. And yeah, you'll get maybe, let's say it's 10% of your total development cost fee. You'll have to pay half of that, maybe 75% of that as deferred, and it has to be paid out over 12 years. So pretty much all of the NOI you're getting from the building, instead of the operating cash flow that goes through a waterfall, it all goes to, most of it goes to pay back your deferred developer fee for the first 12 years. And then after year 12, maybe there's other stuff you can do. That's, you do get some residual cash flow. But if you think about the OpEx ratio of averaging 60% AMI and what we talked about on sizing a senior debt perspective, your cash flow is not as high as your cash flow otherwise would be in a market rate building. And there are things and policies that governments have that address that and change that. But it's a puzzle while working with the DMV. Like you're a market rate guy, you get senior debt, you work with brokers, you work with banks, you get equity, and then you go. That's just not the case in LIHTC. You're compiling a minimum of 3 to 4 sources, and there's a structural gap that is intended to support public-private partnerships ever since LIHTC was created in the 1986 tax reform.
So here's a technical question. When you're doing this LIHTC project, I'm putting capital at risk, whether it's pursuit costs for geotech, phase 1, architecture, engineering, depending on the municipality. You might need a full set of drawings before you can get your plans approved. But you mentioned that developers will put like $100 into a deal. Does that just get refunded through that like the subordinate debt, or how does that typically work?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I was only talking about the permanent financing sources. After you've closed everything, you've started construction, your equity is maybe $100. There are often cases like deferred fee can look a little bit like equity. Some deals require sponsor loans. But yes, the real risk in a LIHTC development is that pre-development time, because nobody is going to fund you and close until you have permits. There's a ton of money you have to spend before you get permits. So, and it's even more because there's a lot of staff time embedded in applying for LIHTC, applying for those other sources. California is somewhat unique, but I saw a stat that in a recent year, only 1 out of every $7 of affordable housing subsidy applied for in the state of California was actually granted in that year. California is specifically unique, but what happens to the sponsors with those 6 of the other $7? Well, oftentimes you wait a year or you wait 2 years and you keep applying, and maybe you can change your project so it scores a little bit better. Of course, that oftentimes increases costs. You're out redevelopment. So like one of the reasons the developer fee is so high is there is so much you're out in the pre-development period. You get reimbursed if the project closes. The vast majority of those expenses are reimbursable at the closing table. But if you thought it was going to take 2 years to close on financing from when you acquire a site, and it really takes 5 years, that's a lot of additional pre-development time. A 10-15% developer fee once you're closed sounds really high, but it does backfill a lot of the pre-development costs. There are lenders that oftentimes there's a structured fund where I'm thinking about the DC Preservation Fund. I'm based in the DC region, where the city put in a certain amount of money as top loss and enables CDFIs, lists.
What is CDFIs? What is that?
CDFI is a community development financial institution.
Oh, okay.
They were essentially set up to lend to folks that banks wouldn't traditionally lend to.
Like me.
Not kind of like you, but also kind of with a mission focus.
Yeah.
So in this case, CDFI will manage some money, so act as a fund manager where they will offer below market bridge loans because they get some below market capitalization from banks depending on how the fund is structured, and they get, sometimes they get funding from a local government, and a local government comes in and says, we want you to do mission, we're buying the mission, we're not buying yield, we're not buying a return. So if you're in DC, what you can do is you go to the DC Preservation Fund and say, this is a building that would be great for a LIHTC preservation. It's going to take me 2 or 3 years to apply for that. The seller needs to know I'm buying this land for this building now. In most markets, sellers don't offer 2 or 3 year PSAs. So you're out bridge financing that is typically full recourse to the borrower, which is it's tough and means that particularly if you're a nonprofit and couple LIHTC deals, you invest a lot of money in pre-development and it goes bad or you can't close, it can severely impact your organizational ability to do a deal, even if you're not out investing millions and millions, hundreds, tens of millions, like a market rate guy would invest on kind of a large scale project.
Interesting. You mentioned that acronym that I can't remember now, but I want to talk about kind of transitioning outside of LIHTC into other creative structures that you've seen. We have talked offline about Utah's Housing Preservation Fund, where they go and buy existing buildings and just keep the rents low naturally. What are some other creative structures that you've seen?
Yeah, so LIHTC is great and it's limited, but it is the largest generation of affordable housing we have in this country after we decided as a country to stop investing in public housing and move that to a public-private sector partnership. LIHTC is enduring. The fact of the matter is there are some challenges and incentives, what happens with that policy design that we'll talk about, but also the majority of folks who could be eligible to live in affordable housing, live in a LIHTC building, the majority of them are just living in market rate units, and oftentimes they're cost burdened. They're living at the market. And what is really intriguing to me and where I spend a lot of my time focusing is there are folks who are great at LIHTC who do LIHTC well. Great. They need more money. They need, if you change the 50% test to the 25% test, which is what Congress has been considering, that'll create more affordable housing is great. But there's also some structural challenges that the incentives that we were talking about that work for market rate don't necessarily work the same way for affordable housing. For LIHTC, that's why you see in California $1 million per unit to build, and then a market rate guy will be like, it's expensive, but I can build for $400K a unit. They're not necessarily comparing apples to apples, but part of why LIHTC generally costs 30% more to build than a comparable non-LIHTC building. A lot of that is developer fee that we talked about, where your profit is embedded in that. California costs $1 million to build a LIHTC unit. Market rate guy would be like, what are you doing? I'm building it for less. Well, that is true, but that's true for, developer fee is less and different. It's also true because when you're applying for all those different sources, that is something that takes time. And, the things that make you a good affordable housing developer are different than the things that make you a good market rate developer. But fundamentally, it's a constrained system. And because it's a constrained system, I'm really excited by what can be done to be additive to the system so more folks are not cost burdened. Not being cost burdened is really important. That means you have more money to spend in the rest of the economy. It means for a household, if you're paying 50% of your income in rent, it means you're probably not paying for after school activities for your kids. Like, there are much better outcomes for children when families are not rent burdened. So when I think about the question of what can we do to create affordable housing outside of LIHTC, let the LIHTC experts continue building LIHTC, but what can we do to do more? The economics of it look a little bit more like a market rate deal. But market rate deal, the best way to generate more return is to raise rents. I don't want to do that. So what are the other things you can do to create housing that isn't necessarily raising rents? What are the other ways to do value add? There's a couple. Depends on, but at a basic level, you can reduce your costs or you can increase your NOI. Increasing NOI is somewhat easier. Let's say we're not gonna increase rents. Well, you could get a tax abatement. So there are tax abatements or payments in lieu of taxes that many jurisdictions have. That is a form of value add that increases your debt load because you have that agreement. You're providing affordable housing. The government isn't requiring as much in property taxes. There is a side piece of how do you make sure those tax abatements are targeted correctly. PFCs in Texas, a lot of them were kind of scams where folks were just buying market rate buildings, continuing to operate them like market rate buildings, but calling them affordable and getting tax abatement. That is a fair thing for someone to do. That's not something I'm interested in because it's not mission driven. But that structure, if you're actually keeping rents the same or reducing rents, is actually a really awesome structure that's fairly common. Other things you can do, better property management. There are things you could do on reducing your OpEx or, there's a lot of energy around green energy retrofits in affordable housing. The payment standard is folks are not paying more than 30% of their income on housing costs. If you have a $200 utility bill and you reduce that utility bill to $50 a month because you're installing,
solar panels,
whatever, like you can charge that tenant $150 or more in rent. That can help capitalize those hard cost payments. Sometimes you can get money from the government, GGRF or other folks to help pay for that. And everyone wins, and the planet wins. It's great.
Everybody wins.
But that can be challenging. So there are things you can do on the NOI side that are value add that don't increase rent. On the cost side, if you think about how a LIHTC developer is compensated, their developer fee is a percentage of their total of eligible basis, which is most total development costs, and there's a bunch of complexity in it. But basically, you're paid a percentage of the amount of work you have to do. And you're paid more for hard costs than you are just for acquisition costs, just the way the program is designed. So if you're thinking about just like a class B, B- apartment building in an area of growth where, 10 years from now, it'll be, closer to an A- market. The idea is that the Utah Preservation Fund does, what the Washington Housing Conservancy does, what a lot of nonprofits do is they'll buy those properties and just keep them kind of good, keep them running, keep them flowing. One of the earlier case studies I use this is the King County Housing Authority. So in the Seattle area, the King County Housing Authority is the largest landlord. They own more units than anyone else in King County. Outside of Seattle, because Seattle has a separate housing authority, they own about 20% of all the garden apartment buildings in the city of Bellevue, Washington. Bellevue is to where I grew up, it is one of the highest opportunity areas in the region. They started buying them in the 1990s at 9, 10 caps. Now it's a 3.5 cap market, even still, given where interest rates are. And they were purchasing it by reducing their costs, because fundamentally, when you buy an older building, you're buying typically below replacement cost. It's going to be less expensive than building a new building all over. So they built a pipeline. They built a portfolio of these older apartment buildings and continue to operate them. But you can't really change how much the market is. So we're going into reducing costs side of it, and you can't really change how much the market will charge for an acquisition of a building. That's driven by the market. There are some sellers who will accept a little bit less money for a mission purpose, but you can't just...
Very rare. Yeah.
It's rare, and you can't expect your market to work like that. That's just not how markets work if you want to be at scale. There are things you can do on the financing side. So senior debt, Freddie and Fannie both have programs, sponsor-initiated affordability, that will give you longer amortization, slightly lower rates. It helps, but not something that can change, that can make you compete against a true value add guy going for the same property. And I think this is where some of the funds that I've been involved with start working, because fundamentally, if you're on the market rate side, I can't change how much a building costs or how much a building is to build. But what I can change is financing costs. So banks' job is to get repaid. So there are some things they could do, particularly with agency debt, like maybe AM and DSCR. We have a huge slug of equity, and I'm not out in the market trying to raise equity, but that's a 15-20% expected return for, depending on what you're looking for. So what is it that can be done that can I replace as much of that 15-20% return money with money that doesn't require that high of a return? Can I replace it with 9% money? Can I replace it with 3-4% money that takes the place of equity, and your yield on cost goes down? Your cash on cash goes down because you're restricting revenue, but your IRR can go up depending on the circumstances because you're putting in so much less equity. Or maybe you're a GP who you're putting in all the equity instead of an LP. Creating funds like that, there are lots of examples of those funds across the country. The NOAA Impact Fund in Minneapolis is a notable one, where they have a preferred equity product that comes in at 6.5% to 10-year investment. They're paying, 90% of the equity, so traditional 90-10 split.
Oh, wow.
6.5%, and you compared to a normal pref. There's a bunch of complications in that, but the basic idea is like, can you buy a building that would otherwise go to a value add guy, but keep it, the value is in your creative capital stack instead? That's what I'm really excited about. And that's a lot of what I support in terms of helping local governments create those sorts of funds, as well as helping impact investors, understand and deploy from funds with that, basic framing of, affordable housing requires permanent subsidy, permanent being anywhere from 10 to 20 plus years. What can we do to make it work and, outcompete the value add business model that has a lot of capital flowing into that space, where folks who just want to preserve a Class B building because folks are at risk of displacement, that's not necessarily the easiest thing to do, because most subsidy sources don't align with that sort of business model.
So If I was a city and I said I wanted to set up one of these funds, how would you advise me to do that? Like, what does that process look like?
Yeah, so you can call a consultant. We'll work with you, understand your goals and mission. It really starts and depends, like, what are your values and priorities? The limitations from a local government side are really about amount of capital and prioritization of allocations. Something we see in some funds is what I call the Christmas tree effect, where everyone adds an ornament of something that is good. Let's say you're in a pretty blue state. Prevailing wage sounds great. It creates jobs for folks in your communities. Prevailing wage also oftentimes costs more. Bird-friendly glass is a fun example. Funds don't necessarily like birds are important. We should keep bird, and one of the leading causes of death of birds is running into glass windows because birds don't perceive glass. So you can create bird-friendly glass by putting dots in the windows. Bird-friendly glass also costs a little bit more than just normal glass. So a question is for a local government is, what are actually your priorities? Do you want, I'm making up numbers. Do you want 1,000 units, but a bunch of birds are going to die? Or do you want 975 units and all the birds stay alive, from those buildings? That's kind of a ridiculous example. But if you think about it in terms of other sorts of policy choices, like prevailing wage or net zero new development requirement or otherwise, all the ornaments start adding up, and they're using housing to fulfill other sorts of goals. It can be challenging for the housing itself. So it really is a conversation about prioritizing. What is the goal? What is the 1, 2, 3 goals? And let's say the goal is preservation of housing. Then it becomes a bit of a market study of what is the financial products that is not in the market that could be offered to the market that makes these deals work. That means I can pay $1 more than the other guy who is going to displace folks. That sizing, not every deal is going to be a fit. If you are in a really high cost area of a market, if you're in
New York, Miami,
I'm trying to give an example
like that
of a market that nobody's going to be mad at me for talking about.
They can be mad at me. That's okay.
I'll talk about Utah because I know very little about Utah, Salt Lake City. If you're in downtown Salt Lake City, and it's like a Class B garden apartment. There are folks who are going to buy it for land banking purposes, who maybe they're going to pay a little bit more for that, and what you would need to preserve that is really grant money above senior debt. Maybe you're farther out on the Wasatch Front, or you're closer out to Daybreak, where still a great area, but not necessarily within the path of growth, and don't necessarily have as high of market rents. And you can actually pay debt service. The way this is normally designed is we'll see what sort of funding can work. Government funding is typically low cost subordinate debt, 1 to 3%, paid out of residual cash flows, but it's limited. What you can do is you can create a leveraged fund where government puts in, 20, 25 million, it puts in a certain amount of money, often through a CDFI, community development financial institution, and that CDFI leverages it with money from their balance sheet, money from other sources of funding. Oftentimes money from banks will be investors in funds. Banks have requirements to serve their community in affordable housing through the Community Reinvestment Act. So a CRA motivated lender will offer lower rates to something that enables them to get CRA credit. Example that one of those funds I worked on was in Wake County, North Carolina, where HRNA, the consulting firm I work for, did a housing plan for the county, made some recommendations. The recommendations were were implemented. They had bigger housing staff. They created a gap financing program for LIHTC. And one of the recommendations was create a preservation fund. And from that preservation fund, we did a feasibility study. We helped them manage an RFP, and we helped them select Self-Help Ventures Fund, which is an affiliate of Self-Help Credit Union, one of the largest CDFIs in the country that now manage the fund. It was $10.5 million from Wake County appropriation that started it. The city of Raleigh came in for $4 million, and the CDFI levered it. It's now about a $60 million fund that's active in the market. And they've done a deal, at least one, and kind of as interest rates have increased, the value of their product, mezzanine debt product, mezzanine debt, subordinate debt, preferred equity, there are distinctions between them, but from a capital stack sources perspective, I'm using them interchangeably. It's something that will work. And it's, an opportunity for nonprofits and for-profits to preserve housing. That's a fund that's out there. What I like to call that, the Amazon Housing Equity Fund also comes in to kind of replace equity, help, design that and help deploy it as well. But really kind of what comes from the Wake County Fund is almost a synthetic version of the funding from the Amazon Housing Equity Fund. There are some pretty important differences that I'm not going to get into, but happy to have kind of one-on-one conversations if folks are really interested in kind of fund design. There are other folks who are doing it. So JBG Smith, Fortune 400 REIT, had created the Washington Housing Initiative several years ago. As part of that, they have a fund that offers mezzanine debt to nonprofits in the DC region. They're a really great platform as well. So there are a lot of different funds that do this, some with public funding, some with non-public funding. I personally view public funding is really important because very few other funders are willing to take that risk of not being repaid for a mission. And that risk of not being repaid for a mission is what can blend down the cost of capital and can be something that you're deploying. I talked about the NOAA Impact Fund in Minneapolis. You're deploying preferred equity at 6.5% instead of deploying it at 9 or 10%, which every additional bit of return requirement that you reduce means you're going to be able to serve more households because you're allowing your purchaser of that market rate housing that they're going to convert to affordable housing to pay just $1 more and outcompete other purchasers in the market who make money in a more conventional way.
And when you're setting up these funds, since I'm a greedy developer, I want to know how these people get paid. I'm sure that's a conversation that has a lot of back and forth. Like, I want a 3% asset management fee or 2% or 1%, and they kind of have this back and forth. Is that how it goes, or how does that really?
Yeah, folks need to be paid. I think one of the challenges is every additional cost you layer in reduces the amount of mission you're able to do theoretically. Folks deserve to get paid. Market is 150 to 250 bips. So if I'm a fund deploying at 6.5%, that means I'm probably providing a weighted average return to all of my investors of 4.5%. So, it really helps when you have 0% money that can blend it down so other folks can get 5 or 6% money.
That is nice.
Typical leverage is actually pretty close to what you would see at a project level. You typically want at least 20 to 30% kind of top loss, equity style position. And then the remainder can be paid back. There's a lot of complexities, and happy to bore you to tears about Monte Carlo analyses and calculations of current expected credit losses from a subordinate loan perspective. But essentially, you don't want to lever too much because then you might not have enough top loss that the folks who expect to be repaid don't get repaid. And folks who expect to be repaid will give you a lower return requirement because they have a pretty good confidence in getting repaid. But like, that's what kills me. Like, you have money that every time you add 200 basis points, it just means you're not necessarily serving folks as directly. What you can also do is some funds are set up that they capitalize the asset management fee into a grant. So kind of as a pass through. So if money comes in at 4.5%, instead of charging 6.5%, the fund can charge 4.5%, but all of their ongoing costs are paid via a grant in addition to a loan. There are a lot of ways to set it up and structure it in ways that make sense for all the investors. It's also it's a lot of work getting all the investors on board, particularly when many of the investors are oftentimes CRA motivated banks. So there's a lot that goes into setting up a structured fund and really stretching public subsidy even farther. But when you compare the public subsidy per unit created or preserved from a structured funds like what I'm talking about versus gap financing for a LIHTC project, oftentimes the public subsidy per unit using kind of a levered fund is magnitude lower than for gap finance for LIHTC. Now, it's important to note the units aren't necessarily as good. Like, you're preserving a Class B building, and there are reasons you do that, and maybe you're doing something else. You can also use the same thing for new construction as well. It's just the same math about reducing equity return requirements and moving it to reduced rent for tenants. But many times, you're not creating a new shiny unit the way you would for LIHTC, and a lot of the ornaments that are added in a LIHTC QAP are things that actually people and elected officials like. So it's not a one-to-one substitute. I'd say we need more housing in general, but in places like the 35 states where more local funding to LIHTC is not going to create more LIHTC units, it just moves around where those units are. I think it's really important to look at what are the alternatives and how can I harness the power of kind of market rate folks or folks who can think more like market rate developers to do affordable housing.
And when you're consulting on like the city level, are you working with like the city council, the staff, the mayor, like all of the above, or how does that kind of?
It really depends based off of kind of the local government in a certain area. I'll say we work with a lot of very high capacity local governments that do having a housing department, or it's the economic development wing. I also have colleagues, I work a lot on funds and transactions. I have colleagues who set up for the state of Maine their regional housing production targets. So kind of like they created the methodology for it, kind of like ARENA that you see in California, but for Maine, and then also created a dashboard that anyone can see what the housing environment is, both within their community as well as compare their community to any other part of the state. And we've done it in Maine, we've done it in a couple other places, but that is mainstatehousingdata.org is kind of an example of, we're working with folks at the LIHTC as well as folks in the Department of Economic and Community Development. This wasn't necessarily a fund. This was more kind of policy analysis and policy work that my colleagues worked on. But it really depends. Sometimes we'll work with a very small government where, we're not only presenting to a city council, we're like meeting with the mayor, or sometimes it's the mayor who has a vision and we're helping implement the mayor's vision. Sometimes it's through like a county manager or a city manager. It really depends on the specific jurisdiction.
So the problem with one of the many problems with affordable housing is people love the idea of affordable housing, but they don't like the implementation, specifically when it's within a baseball throw away from their house. So how are you, this is a loaded question, but how are you kind of navigating that aspect of it? Because these city council members, they run on the platform of housing affordability, but when it comes to putting affordable housing in their jurisdiction, they get a lot of pushback. So how do you navigate that situation?
Yeah, so that's typically a developer navigating the situation. I mean, I'm typically on the side of kind of programs, policy, structuring, design, and the politics of housing is very different at the project level than it is at the macroeconomic level. At the macroeconomic level, it's a lot of focus on economic development and workforce attraction and retention. But at the project by project level, like it's a natural impulse to like not want something new near you. Like I served on my advisory neighborhood commission for almost 7 years in DC. In DC, they have volunteer elected officials who kind of at the neighborhood level weigh in on any sort of discretionary applications like historic preservation or zoning or alcohol application. And community engagement process is challenging. I think the way that I think about it from a system standpoint is the more that is by right means there is less that can be fought from NIMBYs. So when I think about structuring it, one of California is a great example of a lot of policies, can be a problematic example of a lot of policies. But one of the things about California is there's state preemption that says if you are a certain percent affordable, you can just build. You don't have any discretionary entitlements from a local government. That's great. I think we should have more of that. And I, as a person who, if we think about how the housing market works, more housing is good. But I also think like deed restricted affordable housing targeted for affordable is also good. So if we're going to have that state preemption laws and include some amount of affordability in it, some deals won't work because they need all to be market in order to make that individual project work. But you're getting a share that's affordable as long as it's calibrated correctly, that actually you're getting 10, 20, 30% of a number instead of zero production. I think that's a great way to do it. The politics of California are also pretty challenging and different from other places. I'll use DC as an example where the city council actually does not have control over development. It's through the zoning commission. And
Whoa.
it's a legacy of racism. So District of Columbia is a city entity. We don't have senators. We don't have an elected representative. We have a delegate. But as part of that, we didn't have an elected mayor that we elected until after civil rights in the late 1960s, early 1970s. So when the federal government gave DC the authority to elect a mayor, gave DC home rule, not everything was given full home rule. So the zoning commission in DC, which sets zoning laws, are a mix of federal and local appointees. It's a way that Congress is still, holding its power over the District of Columbia. I say that as an extreme example of kind of where DC is different than other places, but other states, if you're a Dillon rule state, it's much easier to do state preemption than if you're not in a Dillon rule state. But it really does vary kind of in terms of what the politics are on a local, on a jurisdiction by jurisdiction basis that do impact the project capital stack. I will say DC has fewer discretionary development approvals than some other places, but part of that is because actually the process to get a planned unit development is so risky and time intensive in DC that folks don't even try to build better than the underlying zoning.
Interesting. I want to bring it home with we kind of talk primarily about apartments, but there are some other, I guess, ways to create affordability that doesn't necessarily involve a 5/1 apartment complex. So single room occupancy, mobile home parks, ADUs. Do you see a lot more of that on the future? Or where do you think the future of affordable housing is trending outside of apartments?
Yeah, so we talked a lot about increasing NOI and reducing costs, and those are important. And I'm really encouraged by middle housing because you're building in the United States, you're building stick frame instead of stick over concrete, and building stick frame is cheaper. I think the other aspect is there's a land availability aspect. And what new construction affordable housing LIHTC is good for is you really need a certain type of parcel that, one, fits your QAP, and two, fits market conditions, and has the right size. Unless you're in New York City, you're not going to build 1,000-unit affordable housing building. New York City is special for a wide variety of reasons. But there's only so much multifamily land availability. And when I think about other opportunities, I really think about increasing land availability opportunity. I'm really encouraged by, because if we say housing is what matters, and we think about filtering as the reason folks are cost burdened, folks who earn less are cost burdened, is because folks who earn more than them are paying more for them for their space. You add more space at the top end, you then kind of change the filtering framework, and it's easier for everyone in kind of the market. So what you're doing with ADUs and middle housing is you're allowing more density in places that are less, that are single family currently and infill. And so I'm really encouraged. ADUs are also a wealth generation opportunity for folks to build wealth in their backyard. I'm a little agnostic about whether it's an individual homeowner doing it themselves and building wealth for themselves, or whether the embedded value of the extra density allows them to sell, and then that's how they build wealth. But ADUs are great. Middle housing is great. Just like building more housing, particularly infill locations, is just really important.
Great. Cool. Well, if anybody wants to reach out to you for fund consulting or anything housing affordability wise, what's the best way to?
You can email me dwarwick@hraadvisors.com. You can reach me on Twitter, Tanner. That's how I get to know you, Daniel M. Warwick. Sometimes my tweets are a little spikier than what you might otherwise see, and you'll definitely see some stuff in there. Also, give me a call, 202-517-0012. In real estate, people just cold call you. Yes, it's both the best thing in the world and the worst thing in the world. So I figured I would kind of give that out as well. And thank you for taking the time.
Yeah, thank you.